Good morning, everyone. Firstly, big thank you to the organisers for providing me with the opportunity to co-chair. Yes, we've got some hurrahs at the back. I think we didn't hear about Pink just then, right? So Pink is also in town, which is why all of us paid what we did to fly all the way here from the west. So I've got the wonderful pleasure this morning, and I'm basically here until lunchtime. So I'm co-chairing the next 4 sessions with Rosemary Richard, who obviously needs no introduction. What I want to do is just briefly set the scene for what we're going to hopefully do and achieve between now and lunchtime. So we have 4 sessions, which will take us all the way up to lunch. The main theme of these sessions is going to be around export markets, but with a focus on the opportunity this presents for Australian companies. We're going to start with a journey around the world to look at the different markets, and I'll introduce our keynote shortly. We'll then come back to Australia and hear from some of our local companies, as well as some international talent that obviously work within the Australian industry, about what's out there and what opportunities are out there. We're going to hear about some work the industry's been doing around market development, and then hopefully we'll close out the 4 sessions with a reasonably positive, forward-looking discussion around what we can do as an industry, and try and take away some action. So what does the walk the talk look like post today? Just a little bit of housekeeping, with the exception of a short intro that I'm going to do for our keynote this morning. We are not going to torture you with 20-minute bio reading at the beginning of each of the panels. So we're going to do simple introductions. So if you want to know more about any of the speakers, can you please just go and have a look on the app, connect with them on the app, and then obviously come and see them after they've spoken. For those that haven't, and we just had a nice reminder, make sure you've got the app. So if you click on the agenda, go through to the session, you'll find a live Q&A. So we're encouraging, given the amount of certainly Q&A sessions that we're going to be doing this morning, please put your questions in there and we'll do our best to get to them. So that does the housekeeping. I'm really looking forward to it. We're hoping to have substantive conversations this morning. These sessions work a lot better with input from you guys, so I will be attempting to extract questions throughout the morning. But with that, I'm going to move on to our first session, which is a keynote. And so I'd like to introduce Deepak Anand. So Deepak has 15 years of leadership experience in the health, non-profit, private sectors in both North America as well as in Europe and Asia. Within the global cannabis sector, Deepak has worked with senior government officials, politicians, policymakers, health professionals, clinical practitioners, educators, investors, patients, as well as producers. He's also served on the boards of various international pharmaceutical associations across Canada, the United States and Europe. Currently, Deepak serves on a variety of boards within the international cannabis space, which includes not-for-profit advocacy and patient-driven organisations. Deepak regularly contributes to international media and Canadian media around some of the issues around cannabis. And so with that, I'd like to introduce to the stage Deepak Anand for his keynote session this morning.
Thank you. Thanks to MCIA for having me, and thank you especially to Meredith, Patty, and the rest of the crew for organizing Cannabis. My name is Deepak Anand. As was mentioned, I've sort of been around the international cannabis space for quite a while now. And today's presentation is really, going over different markets with you all, telling you about what's happening in key markets, backed by numbers. So the presentation's pretty heavy on data and content. I don't intend to walk through this in its entirety, but I think what I'll give you is my thoughts on some of the slides and what I think is important as it relates to exporters as well as the local market, and also policy and regulatory developments. Just a quick confidentiality warning. I'm happy to share the presentation with you. If you'd like a copy, I'll at the end put my email and contact info. Don't hesitate to reach out, and I'm happy to share that with you. So the first slide really talking about medical cannabis access, and the key theme here is that there is global momentum on legalization for medical purposes. So the countries mentioned here certainly start from early 2003 and then come all the way to 2023 and 2024 in terms of some countries that are looking at legislation for medical cannabis. Most importantly, this year, Ukraine looked at legalizing medical cannabis. And then we have Spain and the Philippines coming out in the not too distant future. Similarly, for recreational cannabis, lots of momentum happening, particularly in Europe. There's been some key developments in places like Germany and other markets that we'll be talking about through this presentation. Medical geographies, just keeping in mind some of the important markets and where things are evolving. Certainly a lot is happening in the EMEA region, and also a lot happening, of course, in the Americas and Asia Pacific. So I intend to cover sort of some of the key markets with you and what's happening there. So just starting off with Europe and the medical cannabis markets within Europe. Of course, Europe has a medical cannabis access pathway that allows access to cannabinoid therapies for medical purposes. Unfortunately, there's really no harmonization within Europe. There's certainly a lot of players here that are participating in the international market. That comes up quite often. So what that means for you if you're a cultivator or a manufacturer, if you're trying to sell products to places within Europe, like Denmark, Poland, Germany, and the UK, you have a completely separate, almost set of regulations that you need to comply with. It's not a one-size-fits-all model, meaning you couldn't sell the exact same product in the way that it's manufactured. In those markets, you have to go through additional steps like stability, like looking at pesticides, like looking at product registration. And it really isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, so there really isn't harmonization. I think in Europe, the common theme is, with the European Union, everything is about harmonization. Unfortunately, on medical cannabis, that's the furthest thing from the truth, where it's a completely separate set of regulations. So really important to keep in mind, if you're looking at the European geography, that you're really understanding, just because you have TGA, GMP, or European Union GMP, it doesn't mean that that's sort of the be-all and end-all. There's a lot more to think about as you start to get into selling into those markets. And you'll hear from people like LGP and others today on some of the challenges that they've been through in getting products into places like France and Poland, et cetera. So really starting off with Israel, the oldest kind of medical cannabis market for a long time. Pretty steady growth in both patient numbers, obviously with the most recent unfortunate situation with the war. There's a lot of patients that are coming into the medical market in Israel. This slide intends to give you a little bit of update by numbers, both on patient growth, but also on sort of where product is coming from, what's happening on imports versus exports. I know we'll have a fun discussion on sort of the Israeli anti-dumping issue, but nonetheless, certainly is quite a growing and a significant market with respect to medical cannabis. Unfortunately, we're not seeing a lot of exports coming out of Israel, and we'll cover this during our panel discussion on why that might be the case, and it has a lot to do with the regulatory kind of structure. Just talking a little bit about active patients and also talking a little bit about sort of the breakdown on disease conditions as to why patients are coming and consuming medical cannabis in the Israeli market, and this gives you a bit of a breakdown on what that actually looks like. Next market, Germany. Apologies, I think it looks like this slide is a bit jumbled, but happy to share you sort of a version that isn't as confusing as this, but really what the theme here is that it became the first country within Europe to be able to look at allowing imports of medical cannabis, and certainly quite a bit of growth with respect to getting into that market. Of course, EU GMP is a requirement, or TGA GMP for that matter, as part of the mutual recognition process, is a requirement to get into that market. But as I mentioned, there's quite a bit more that comes into selling a product into Germany without just EU GMP. There's also a very important aspect of stability that you need to look at before you can sell products into that market. This is a bit of sort of the patient growth as well as the breakdown of different products between flower versus isolates and extracts in the market. Gives you a bit of indication on where the growth is and what we're sort of looking at within the German market. And this is a breakdown a little bit more on extracts. So certainly we've seen dronabinol, which is one of the cannabis products in addition to flower that certainly is seeing a lot of growth within the German market. But what's also interesting is now we're starting to see extracts really grow. Of course, there's a number of companies like Aurora, Tilray, and others that are currently selling products into that market and have extracts. But extracts is a pretty significantly growing kind of segment of the market, and we'll see that soon. Really important thing on medical cannabis before I jump to Poland really quickly, I should mention with the recent changes that are coming up in Germany, there's been a lot of noise on sort of legalization and what that means from a recreational perspective. But I think what's really lost in the conversation is that when Germany looks at legalizing cannabis, there's a big component within that which is basically allowing medical cannabis to be opened up. And what that means is currently medical cannabis is regulated as a narcotic in Germany. And with the changes that are bundled up into adult use or recreational cannabis legalization, there's also a measure to be able to take cannabis off as a narcotic. And what that means is that the number of prescriptions that you'll start to see for medical cannabis are going to grow pretty significantly. And if you ask me, I think that's probably what I'm excited the most about within the German market is really the opening up of medical cannabis, because we'll get into this a little bit later on what the recreational kind of inputs mean. But the long and short of it is that the medical cannabis opening up in Germany is a really interesting opportunity. Poland, another really interesting market with respect to what we're seeing. It's not for the faint of heart to be able to get into Poland, as I'm sure some of my colleagues in the room will attest to. It takes anywhere from 2 to 3 years almost to get products registered into that market. But it's a very, very interesting market outside of Germany with respect to what we're seeing in patient numbers, patient growth, and what we'll end up seeing in the next few years in terms of market growth within that Polish market. Italy, another really interesting market. So far, we've seen 5 companies that basically have won tender process to be able to manufacture product. Until most recently, it was more the military that was sort of cultivating medical cannabis and selling it, but that obviously is going to change very soon. And again, we're seeing pretty significant growth with respect to both patient numbers in that market as well as the different conditions for which medical cannabis is being accessed in that market. Coming to Portugal, Portugal has become a mecca for medical cannabis companies. Quite a few companies have set up in that market. Domestically, obviously, it's still a very, very small market, but the reason people are excited about Portugal is that there's a number of EU GMP cultivators and manufacturers that have set up there, so people are bringing in a lot of product from outside that is non-GMP and converting it magically into GMP products. And so that's why there's a lot of activity happening in Portugal. You hear a lot about it, but really from a local medical market, there isn't a lot of growth. There's some growth, but not massive amounts of growth within that domestic market. Similarly for Netherlands, of course, having had access to coffee shops for a very, very long time, its medical market, has been around also for a while. We saw Bedrocan, which is one of the largest producers within Europe, set up and have their home base in Netherlands. Certainly starting to see, medical cannabis be available in Netherlands, but not seeing the growth because there is a recreational program. And that's a very common theme that we see in places like North America. When you start to have a adult use or a recreational program, you start to see a bit of a drop-off on medical. UK, another really interesting market. We're starting to see a lot of growth within the UK market. But again, there are challenges with who can prescribe. You need to be on a specialist register to be able to prescribe medical cannabis. So you haven't really seen the massive taking off of the market in the UK as many would have liked to see, but also is a market that's ripe for significant growth. We're seeing a lot of companies, make themselves available in that market. And once you start to move away from sort of this specialist prescribing route, which is expected to happen soon, you'll start to see pretty significant growth within that market. Denmark, again, another market that's sort of been up and down. There was a company called CanTrust out of Canada that had some challenges. They were supplying the Danish market with a lot of product. We saw them unfortunately collapse, and that resulted in a pretty significant outcome of lack of availability for patients. But what we are starting to see now is the medical cannabis market pick back up. Still a small market within Europe, but nonetheless seeing some growth within that market. Czech Republic, also another really interesting market. Product availability is a bit up and down in terms of what's in that market, but we're still seeing some growth there and expecting to continue and actually pick up over the next few years. France, we'll get into this a little bit later. So far, there's been sort of a pilot program in the market which has required companies that have won that tender process to give away product for free for the last 3 years. A lot of expected changes to come out in the French market. They will be stopping the trial program and making the medical cannabis market permanent very soon. Unfortunately, flower will not be available as a product form with those changes coming up, but you are going to see extracts and other products being made available in that market. And we'll talk a little bit more about that during our panel discussion on what the impacts are going to be in France. Switzerland, another really interesting market. We have both medical cannabis that's been legal for quite a while, but haven't allowed imports to come in. In 2023, the government made some changes to actually open up more medical cannabis products coming into the market, and we certainly see products being available. Switzerland has also done something really interesting, and we'll get to this a little bit later on recreational cannabis. They've actually created some pilot projects and are allowing for recreational cannabis to be sold within different cantons. And we'll discuss sort of that model and what's happening very quickly, but there still will be a medical cannabis market within Switzerland. And with the ease of access and opening up, it's expected that there will be some increase in medical cannabis within that specific market. Jumping to recreational really quickly, there's a lot of debate happening in Europe around legalization. Germany's sort of on-again, off-again program has been in the works for a very long time. However, what's really important to understand as a result of that is it's really triggering conversations at a European Union level on what we do with cannabis legalization. So there's a lot of movement within Europe, Germany, of course, being sort of one of the biggest countries within Europe to actually look at legalizing cannabis. On March 22nd, we'll understand if that date is going to be April 1st or if that's going to be November. But nonetheless, it's going to happen this year, and that's triggering a lot of conversations within Europe around what happens to recreational cannabis legalization. We've seen countries like Luxembourg, Malta, etc., come up with different programs, but Germany falling is expected to be sort of a domino effect on a number of European countries, and as well as the European Union, on how they look at and consider recreational cannabis legalization. So really, Germany, just wanted to talk a little bit about sort of, what it really means from a legalization perspective. There's really two pillars that are going to be part of the legalization movement. The first pillar is going to allow social clubs and decriminalization and cultivation at home. And the second pillar is expected to open up more sort of adult use legalization and recreational legalization from a commercial perspective. Very little information on what pillar 2 looks like, but a lot of information on pillar 1, which is basically decriminalization with the option to actually expand medical cannabis, as I was mentioning earlier. That opening up of medical cannabis is expected to be a pretty significant a tailwind for companies that are looking to export. Switzerland, really interesting. Again, sort of the parliament kind of amended the Narcotics Act to allow for scientific pilot projects to happen. What is really interesting about the Swiss pilot project model is they're actually allowing for a variety of cannabis products to be sold, including things like vapes, gummies, etc., in a controlled experiment. So they are actually dispensing this through dispensaries and are keeping track of things like mental health outcomes and are basically saying that that's the argument they're using. The reason that this is important is there are things like UN treaties, which we'll get into later, that talk about what countries can and cannot do with respect to cannabis use for recreational purposes. And the model that Switzerland's basically undertaken is one that says that we're doing legalization in a controlled kind of scientific, from a scientific perspective. So that is compliant fully with UN treaties. And it's going to be really interesting to watch what the INCB and the United Nations actually says about the way that Switzerland's gone about it. Everything that we're hearing is that there's really going to be no argument with respect to Switzerland and the approach that they're taking, because it's complying with UN treaties from a scientific perspective. Same thing with Netherlands. So far, coffee shops were selling products for a very long time. There wasn't really an ask on where that product was coming from. 10 companies were sort of approved to start to sell products and cultivate it in the market, and we're now starting to see them get off the ground. So we will start to see local product being cultivated within the Netherlands by those 10 license holders who will be selling to coffee shops. And so there'll be a more sort of regulated supply chain that is providing safe and tested products into the Netherlands. There was some back and forth last week on sort of what the Netherlands government's approach was going to be. There was some backtracking and expanding the program outside of the greater Amsterdam area. But nonetheless, the pilot projects and sort of these 10 cultivators coming online is going to be a pretty significant movement ahead, because you're going to start to see locally produced and tested product available through the coffee shops. Talking a little bit about the Americas, obviously North America leading the way. Canada sort of became the first G7 country to legalize cannabis. We've seen the US states look at legalization on a state-by-state approach. A lot of sort of, tailwind on legalization happening in the US. Most recently, the Health and Human Services division of the FDA recently published a report which was presented to the DEA to look at sort of changing the schedule of cannabis and the schedule in which it falls. And so with the amending of scheduling, we're expecting a DEA announcement to happen imminently that would look at changing the scheduling of cannabis. And that's going to have a pretty significant impact on things like banking and some other challenges that the US industry has been facing. And it's also going to have some pretty significant impacts on the international side of things. So lots of movement in North America. Of course, Latin American countries, not too far behind. We're starting to see a lot of people that set up operations for medical purposes in places like Colombia, et cetera. And those markets are slowly but surely picking up as well. Just talking about Canada a little bit more in detail. Of course, there's been successful reforms in Canada that happened first on medical cannabis and then eventually on recreational cannabis momentum. Certainly, we've seen a lot of development, in that country. A lot of first with respect to what we did with legalization becoming the first G7 country. And so, there's been a lot of dialogue with the INCB and the United Nations on things like treaties. We've basically taken the approach to the INCB treaty violations as one of principal non-compliance. So we don't agree with the INCB treaties. And also what we've said to the INCB is basically what we do within our borders is really our problem, as opposed to what we do from an external perspective. So what that means is any exports from Canada are really limited to that of medical and scientific purposes. Imports currently are legally permitted, but we haven't really seen a lot of approvals from Health Canada on the importation side. Talking a little bit about the medical cannabis market. Of course, we saw an increase in number of patients pre-legalization, and then post-legalization we saw a little bit of a drop-off. Here are some of the conditions for which cannabis was being prescribed, but now we're starting to see a bit of a drop on medical cannabis within the Canadian market. And this is a further breakdown on some of the different product forms and product types that are available. Again, happy to share the slide with you all a little bit later. This is a slide just talking about sort of household spending on cannabis. We're starting to see quite a bit of an increase on that side. Jumping to Brazil, another really interesting market. We saw medical cannabis being available. We saw CBD products being sold into Brazil from a number of companies globally. We saw a lot of Americans actually start to sell CBD products into Brazil. What's interesting is Anvisa, which is the regulatory body in Brazil, requires companies that are registering products within 5 years to get Anvisa approval. So we're really seeing a flooding of the CBD market where companies are coming in, selling CBD products and getting out before that 5-year window. There's a couple of companies that are actually interested in staying in the medical market that are going through and getting Anvisa approvals for medical cannabis products, but nonetheless, another quickly evolving kind of market on that side. Colombia, again, a number of cultivators set up very early, a low-cost jurisdiction for production. Companies like Clever Leaves, Chiron, Pharmacy Yellow, etc., set up really early there. But unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of domestic involvement of the industry, but certainly seen a lot of exports out from Colombia. Uruguay, again, the first kind of country to really look at, cannabis legalization. We haven't really seen exports pick up as much from Colombia, but nonetheless seem to, have a domestic kind of industry in Uruguay. Just talking about medical cannabis markets, Thailand, of course, Australia and New Zealand, which I won't get into a lot because we've had some coverage from Riz and other people on sort of what's happening locally. I think it's important to touch a little bit on Thailand. So Thailand basically looked at decriminalization of cannabis effectively without regulation, and that has posed a number of challenges. It certainly allowed the industry to go a bit Wild West because you've got cultivators that are basically manufacturing products without any compliance aspects. So there's a lot of products available in Thailand that are not compliant from an international perspective, and now the government's actually looking to roll it back and kind of put the genie back in the bottle as it relates to only allowing medical cannabis in Thailand. I'll skip the sort of Australian slides because I think we've covered most of that. I'll really touch base on New Zealand a little bit. Obviously, we're starting to see a little bit of increase in New Zealand. Again, a really long registration process for those looking to enter the New Zealand market. Keep in mind that MedSafe has a pretty long turnaround from the time that you actually start to register products to the time that you'll be selling products. Of course, we're seeing small kind of cultivators set up there and looking at supplying both the domestic and international markets as well. This is the Thailand medical market. We kind of talked a little bit about it and what that looks like. Of course, because there's been this decriminalized approach, there hasn't really been an uptake or an increase in prescriptions, but these are sort of some of the numbers on what it looks like on the medical cannabis side. With that, I'll get to questions. I think this is meant to be more of sort of an interactive dialogue. I wanted to provide a little bit of context, but happy to take further questions and get into further discussion on this.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks very much, Deepak. Just a reminder, am I too close to the lectern? Just to remind everybody, put your questions into the app. And so I think we've already got one already there. So just joining me on stage, just welcome to Rosemary Richards, who will be looking after a couple of the sessions with me over the morning. So. All right, let's get started. Why don't we actually start? I believe we've got some roving mics around too. So firstly, let's just do a quick, have we got any questions from the floor before we take the ones off the app? Yeah, we've got one over here. Let's get started. So we've got a list of questions, guys, but it works so much better if you guys actually come up. All right. Okay, go for it, Reese.
Hello, good morning. Hi, Reese from Pennington Institute. Thanks, Deepak, great presentation. One thing that jumped out at me was looking at the indications that medical cannabis tends to be approved for in overseas countries. I don't know if this is true or if I just got a sort of a partial insight, but it looked like there were very few approvals for psychiatric conditions like anxiety and depression, which is the complete sort of inverse of Australia. Do you have any insights into that or any comments on how that compares to what we see here?
Yeah, I think Australia certainly seems to have a lot more of those indications that we're starting to see medical cannabis prescribed for. I think if you look at places like Germany, because you're going to have gone through kind of traditional and conventional therapies before people can start to be prescribed medical cannabis, you're starting to see doctors get a little bit more concerned about prescribing for generic conditions. I think the closest comparison is Canada. We saw something very similar happen earlier on in Canada where you were seeing prescriptions for things like depression and anxiety when we had a legal market. Of course, we've seen that change, and we see that very differently in European markets where doctors are a lot more concerned about prescribing for those conditions.
Fantastic. I think we've got a question over here. I'll just get you to stand up, if that's all right, and maybe your name before you get started. It's not.
I don't know if it's working. Simon
We can hear you, Simon.
Simon Tolhurst from Biotica. There's a lot of moving parts around the world at the moment, and obviously we've seen in Europe they're starting to move into, beyond medical, the medical marijuana side of it, into the adult use. They're starting to play in that field. In the States, we're looking at them starting to fix some of the regulatory problems that they've had. Same with Canada. Where do you see North America, Europe in 5 years' time as a market?
Yeah. Look, one thing is certain: the cannabis industry is only going to be bigger in 5 years than where it is today. I don't think there's any downsizing, or the market is not going to reduce. So where do I see these things in 5 years is certainly a growth on cannabis, both for medical and non-medical purposes. I think what we're going to see with the US descheduling, that's something that I'm watching very closely, is a lot of countries getting more comfortable with going ahead and legalizing cannabis. I think one of the big issues that we'll probably see fixed in the next few years is banking and finance. Banking is a massive problem because there's tentacles into the United States from most countries, and banks are very, very hesitant, particularly in smaller countries offshore, about what those US implications mean. So I think what we'll see in the next 5 years is we're definitely going to look at some US descheduling at a minimum, potentially beyond descheduling, depending on what the election outcomes are, but nonetheless, a significant growth poised for both medical and non-medical cannabis. I think people need to be very cautious from a business perspective. It's easy to get ahead of yourselves on the excitement and some of the news headlines on legalization. I think this was a mistake that was made in Canada very early on, and I think people need to pay very close attention to what those mistakes were and learn from them. And which is, what that really translates to is, what does the market look like now? Right? What I'm not hearing in places like Germany is, well, that's great, we're going to legalize cannabis and it's going to be a massive, a few $100 billion market. Great, but that's, it's dependent on legislation, it's dependent on regulation. And what does that mean for you for the next 2 years? Because companies globally are struggling to be able to raise capital, and I think companies that are going to look at focusing on where's the opportunity today, where can I play on medical, what do I need to do to be able to position well, are going to be set up for success. So hopefully that sort of provides a little bit of an overall question for you.
Great.
Okay,
I'm just going to, whilst we get the microphones to the next two questions, so we've got one in the front here and one over the back right. I'm just going to do one of these questions from Peter here. I'm taking a segue from the US market and moving around. So considering in the EU there is free movement across borders, which I'm assuming is for the people, what will stop people travelling to buy?
Yeah, so really not a lot. That's been one of the arguments around, sort of the German approach, and the the European Union had an issue with what happens when you cross borders, because you can get from places like France to Switzerland to different countries very quickly without crossing borders. But there will be restrictions on who can buy it and what you can buy, how much you can possess, and so there will be pretty strong indications. And a classical example of this was in Canada when we were legalizing cannabis. Most people don't know this, but the biggest challenge that we had was from the United States. And now when you cross the border from Canada to the United States, there's a massive warning saying it's illegal to bring cannabis across borders. So I think you'll start to see little notices and warnings, but really you're not going to see a massive kind of enforcement and crackdown on this. There will be implications on people that are traveling from places like Switzerland and Germany into places like France and Italy that happen regularly. But what this really means is that there's going to be some changes in the European level that is having a discussion around what this means. There's already a couple of consumer bills that have been put in to look at things like this and what this means. And I think what you'll see is decriminalization around Europe to be able to address at least the personal possession issue to begin with.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll go to the floor. Okay, yep, starting.
Good morning, David Eddershank, Legalise Cannabis Victoria. Thank you for your presentation, Deepak, that was fascinating. You referenced legalisation in Germany and the potential impact, or the extension, I think you said, of the medicinal cannabis production. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, please.
Sure. So, just to go back, so really two pillars of legalization. Actually, I'll go back even before this. So the existing government, when they were looking at getting elected, one of the big reasons they were running on was the ability to be able to legalize cannabis. So it was a party movement and initiative to be able to do that. I think the government was naive once they got in, to be able to understand how complicated a process legalization of cannabis is, both from a international perspective, but more specifically for Germany, because they're part of the European Union. There's a number of challenges within European Union legislation when countries look at legalization. So I think they underestimated how easy or difficult it would have been to look at legalization. So what happened is, and a lot of time was lost around this, was they had a very ambitious approach to legalization and said, we're going to fully decriminalize, fully legalize, we're going to go gangbusters and allow this industry to take off. And very quickly they realized the European Union said, hold on a second, it's not something that you can do because you wouldn't be compliant with European law. And I think finally what we saw most recently is them understanding what they can do. And what we're now seeing with the two pillars of legalization is what is actually possible within the compliance of that international movement. I'll contrast that a little bit with Switzerland, because if you look at what Switzerland has done, they're part of the European Union. Of course, they're a little bit different in that they're not a fully harmonized EU member, but nonetheless still part of the European Union from a number of things like Schengen, free movement, etc. But really what they said was, we're going to take a more experimental approach and do scientific experiments. Scientific experiments are both possible within European legislation and also international legislation. And so no one's ever looked at Switzerland. They've never had to ask anyone for approval. And they're going about it in a very controlled way. So I think Germany has learned that. I think if they were to redo this, they would have probably looked at the Swiss approach. But notwithstanding that, I think they've had some pretty significant movement now with the approval of the bill in the lower house. There is some concern in the upper house on what that means. And so now what we're seeing is, most likely on the 22nd of March, we're going to have a mediation committee formed in the upper house of Parliament. What the government's basically said is the upper house doesn't really have a say in this, but there's going to be a consultative dialogue. And I think that's going to result in the delay from an April 1st launch date for the first pillar of legalization in Germany to a November date. And the argument really being made is, well, it's going to put a lot of pressure on judges, because as soon as you hit that April 1 date, anyone that has been imprisoned for cannabis possessions would have to be freed. And so I think the justice system is a little bit sort of up in arms, saying we're not prepared for such a short timeline. But nonetheless, I think the really important piece here is by November, you'll see an opening up of both the medical cannabis market, but also decriminalization and people being allowed to go at home, personal possession, and social clubs. So, it's a pretty significant policy movement. And European Union doesn't have an issue with that. So that is now compliant with European Union legislation. Pillar 2, as I said, is a little bit up in the air. No one's actually really publicly disclosed what Pillar 2 is going to look like. But that's going to be more sort of where the commercial industry comes in.
Got a question.
Tony Bassick, ARC MedAg Hub at La Trobe Uni. I just wonder, one jurisdiction you didn't mention at all was the UN, which really drives everything else and classes as a narcotic drug. And if that was resolved, which it was close to a few years ago, then that would solve all the issues everywhere else that we have. Do you know where anything is at with the UN? I know they're preoccupied at the moment with a few other things. But
Yeah, I mean, look, the UN is generally a toothless body. It doesn't really have a lot of say on this. A letter saying you're non-compliant. What do we say back to them? Yes, we agree. We've taken a principal non-compliant approach, something I hope my son never learns. But nonetheless, that's sort of the approach. And we wrote them back and said, yes, we're in violation on a principal non-compliant approach. But guess what? We did this from a public health and safety perspective. Canada had the highest use of underage access to cannabis pre-legalization. So we had a real problem on our hands. And listen, I mean, I'm a huge proponent for cannabis, but it's not a benign substance. And so kids under the age of 18 accessing cannabis at the highest rate in the world. And so we had a serious public health problem within our borders that the United Nations was not going to solve for us. So the approach that we took is, what we do within our borders is our problem. What we do outside our borders is a UN issue. And that's where the UN has impact. And with that, what we've seen now is exporting is permitted for medical and scientific purposes. And so the only product that's leaving Canadian borders is that of medical purposes. And if countries don't have the ability to be able to import, want to import, find it cost effective, that's That's sort of, that's not one of the main goals of legalizations. Really, to answer your question, I mean, the UN is a toothless body. Besides some warning letters, we're not really getting nowhere. I think the second part of your question is, will we see movement? Unfortunately not. You've got staunch countries like Russia that will write to us almost on a monthly basis on how we're not in compliant with cannabis legalization. But really, besides those letters from places like Russia and China, we're not going to see very much. I don't see movement on amending the single convention to be able to remove cannabis anytime soon. And that's quite unfortunate because China and Russia have a very strong position on this, and I don't see that moving anytime soon.
Perhaps I can just have a follow-up question, Deepak. When Paddy and I were in Canada end of last year, there was talk from the regulators there that there was going to be an inspection by the Narcotics Board and a report sometime to be released sometime this year. Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, so I mean, the UN basically has an enforcement entity called the INCB, and that's the International Narcotics Control Board. And basically what that entity does is they monitor sort of cannabis movement. So all countries have to report to the INCB on sort of what their movement of cannabis was. It really applies to medical and scientific purposes. I think Canada is in a little bit of trouble because what we have seen is we've seen not diversion, but a lack of explanation for a few hundred kilos of cannabis and where that went. And I think that's the only element from an INCB perspective where we may get a warning to be able to control sort of the movement of cannabis. We had a provincially licensed retailer called the Ontario Cannabis Store lose 200 kilos of cannabis. And so I think that's the only minor impact that we will see. But really, looking at the tons of cannabis that is being moved around from Canada, there's a pretty great way to track that, and so that's compliant with the INCB legislation.
Who's next?
You'll go in the middle here. Yeah. Hi, Chris Barbe from Mancap Solutions. I've got a question of the impact on legalization on the medicinal cannabis business, if you want, and especially on the impact on investors in continuing to invest in medical cannabis.
Good question.
That's a really good question. So really a two-part question. One, what's the impact on medical cannabis? And second, what's the impact on investors? So the impact on, obviously we've seen this both in Canada, we're seeing this in some US states, we're seeing this in other countries where when you have an adult use program, the medical market declines. I think it really speaks to, unfortunately, how well robust the medical system was in the first place. For example, in Canada, we did a really good job calling cannabis medicine, but did a really poor job regulating it as such. And what I mean by that is you couldn't buy and you still can't buy cannabis in pharmacies. So if you are on a slew of other medicines and you are being prescribed cannabis, you can't speak to your healthcare practitioner about it because a pharmacist really won't talk to you about sort of your condition. So it's not that open. Sure, you can have off-the-cuff conversations, but it really isn't a robust pharmaceutical platform. I think places like Germany, it's going to be really interesting to watch because they do have pharmacy dispensing of medical cannabis. And so what happens post-legalization? The other important piece in the pie with Germany is a number of prescriptions are actually being reimbursed. So I put that up on my slide. So you're starting to see federal reimbursement for medical cannabis. So I don't see a massive move post-legalization in a market like that. Your second question on investors, I think it was brought up yesterday around sort of the misdeployment of funds, and I won't harp on that too much. But what I will say is there is a wall of capital waiting to come into cannabis. There are CPG companies, big tobacco companies, big alcohol companies. I mean, we saw a little bit of it in Canada early on, but there's a whole wall of capital that's looking to come across. And I think what you will see with movements in places like Germany and the US, that changes. As soon as you see a descheduling in the US and you see a launch in Germany, those are two massive catalysts for capital to come into the industry. There's big pharma and big tobacco companies chomping at the bit to get in. So I think we're going to see a massive positive movement on investments.
Fantastic. We've just got one more question from the floor. So those that have put questions onto the app, yeah, we'll do it in the round table. Those that have put questions into the app, we're going to roll into a panel session next, so we will get to them, I promise.
Thanks, Deepak. Paul Long from Little Green Farmer. Just a question regarding the downscheduling in the US and what impact do you think that will have on their ability to export? Obviously, we've got some of the world's largest cannabis companies, so Curaleaf and Verano, multi-billion market cap, very large companies that currently can't export from the US. So Do you think that down scheduling will enable them to export, and do you think that will have an impact on what we see in the Australian market?
No, and I'll cover both imports and exports, even though exports was your question, Paul. Because cannabis is not federally legal yet, it has been regulated on a state-by-state approach. So even simple things like GACP, Good Agricultural Collection Practices, are not being followed by MSOs or multi-state operators in the US. What descheduling is going to do actually is going to be putting some of the existing players into a bit of trouble, because now you're going to have the federal government in the US start to enforce federal FDA legislation on how they cultivate product. So it's going to be actually a bit of a shrinking of the market in the short term, and you'll have some smaller MSOs disappear. But you will see larger MSOs still gain popularity and eventually raise capital. I don't think what that's going to mean is an export of cannabis from the US out into Europe, but what you are seeing is people like Curaleaf really expanding and buying up companies in places like Germany and Portugal and France and the UK. And so I think the way that they're going to grow is by having local operations that are set up in these countries and start to expand that way. On the import side, I think that's been another really interesting question that I get almost all the time is what's it going to look like imports into the US? And we are starting to see actually some THC get into the US for scientific purposes. I think whether they allow mass imports for medical purposes is going to be an interesting question. If the FDA mandates GMP, which I personally think that they're going to do, I think that's where you're going to see a massive opportunity for imports into the US for GMP product. But again, that's all a bit up in the air in terms of what the DEA decides to do.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks very much, Deepak.
Well, we do have lots more questions.